Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. I hope you're having a lovely day. I always enjoy spending this time with you. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, if you would like to interact with me, you can type your comments or questions on whatever platform you happen to be watching this on, and they will appear in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And I hope you're having a good Monday. Our subject for today is Baphomet. This came up in conversation on Friday, and Baphomet is a very, I'm not going to say misunderstood figure, I'm going to say a very variably interpreted figure. Misunderstanding implies that there's an agreed meaning, and there is no such agreement on the figure of Baphomet. Welcome, Bradley, in the chat room. Good to see you. There are interpretations of Baphomet. Hello to Kazan. Hello to Brenda in the chat room. Good to see you both. Interpretations of Baphomet that range from an evil satanic type of entity to a beneficent deity of balance. And I personally come from that latter point of view. I see Baphomet as the same class of deity as, for example, Cybele, or for that matter, primordial deity from the Vangelo delle Streghe, Diana before the division. Hello to Renee in the chat room. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you all. So we'll be talking about some of those different interpretations today. I want to remind you also that I am available for readings, and if you'd be interested in a reading, you can instant message me or send me an email at donlewishp@aol.com. And I am available for tarot, for clairvoyance, or alternatively for past life readings. And hello to Raven in the chat room. Good to see you, Raven. And as you know, we often talk about psychic arts and psychic matters on this program because I've been doing this for a very long time. We also have my Patreon at revdonlewis.com, where we have many different offerings, including this weekend. We did a seminar on mediumship and oracular work, which went very nicely, I thought. Everyone seemed to enjoy it. And if you're a member of my Patreon at the seminar level, or if you're one of the people who had tickets for the seminar, it was recorded and the video is available to you at revdonlewis.com. So coming back to Baphomet, where does Baphomet come from? Most people, if they have any familiarity with the figure of Baphomet, are going to be thinking of the famous 19th century illustration of the androgynous goat-headed deity created by Elifa Levi. This image does not, as such, go back any farther than that period. And that is approximately the mid-1800s. Baphomet itself goes back to the 1300s. And if Baphomet was worshipped as a deity, it would have been in the 13th century. Whether that's true or not is the first big controversy about this figure. All later controversies take a back seat to the question of, was this ever actually a thing in the first place? The accusation was that the Knights Templar, who had been the leading chivalric order of the Christian world, were secretly worshiping a pagan deity called Baphomet, which combined a number of disparate elements and is supposedly represented esoteric teachings, and that they worshipped this deity with tantric rituals involving homosexual relations. This was used as an excuse to suppress the order and to execute most of its members, and not incidentally confiscate its wealth, which was considerable. Although in fact, they appear to have secreted much of their wealth where it could not be reached. And a number of the members do seem to have survived by simply being beyond the reach of the King of France, who is the one who is making these accusations. Was it true? I don't think there's any stretch of the imagination by which it can have been said to be true for the entire order. May it have been true for some of them, possibly. And hello to Atotsli, welcome. Hello to Michael, welcome, good to see you. I always enjoy seeing everyone. I love spending this time with you. My personal belief is that this probably was an esoteric teaching, probably at the center of the order and probably not at the edges. It was too big an order in too hostile an environment for this to have run throughout the entire thing. Where would it have come from if it is true? Hello to Aiden in the chat room. The Knights Templar were primarily located in the Near East, particularly in Jerusalem and other places around there. Hello to Lori in the chat room. This area had been, Egypt and the Near East had been the center of Gnostic teachings and metaphysical revival in the late Roman Empire, and I have no doubt there was still plenty of it running around just these few hundred years later. It probably would have come from there, and the accusations of what Baphomet was strongly resemble esoteric deities from the late antique period, particularly the images of Baphomet, although there is some debate, as in a great deal of debate, as to whether there are any original images of Baphomet. Hello to Anna in the chat room. But those that do exist are very much in line with late Hellenistic, Roman, and early Christian era esotericism. Hello to Mary in the chat room. Good to see you, Mary. The famous image from Eliphas Levi has nothing to do with any of those images because it, as I say, comes from 1856 specifically and no earlier. However, there are other earlier images, including a number that were published by Joseph von Hammer Pugstal in the 18th century, but this is still the 18th century. Several hundred years after this happened, but he claimed to have discovered a number of artifacts dating to the time of the Knights Templar, which supposedly represented Baphomet. And those images, which survive, I believe, primarily in drawings, do strongly resemble late antique art of lesser quality. And also sometimes medieval images of lesser quality in a way that the Eliphas Levi image does not. And they do have some of the same elements. But whether they were fakes, whether they were real, I don't think there is even a possibility of anything more than an educated guess, and that guess is going to be predetermined by the person's thoughts on the matter. Hello to Lavola in the chat room. Good to see you, Lavola. Beautiful name. I'm sure I've said that before. It reminds me of my mother, Laveda. Lovely name. So these images are there, but the commentary on them is hundreds of years after the fact. And the originals, to the best of my knowledge, are not there to be tested, not there to be looked at. They have not survived to the modern era, so what are you going to say? The Knights Templar were ruthlessly suppressed based on these accusations. Again, some of them appear to have been able to escape. They managed to escape with some of their wealth, apparently, or so it was said. And not every kingdom in the Christian world, despite the orders of the Pope, who was under the power of the King of France at the time, cooperated in the suppression. England resisted. I believe Scotland refused. Hello, Julia, in the chat room. So it wasn't a total suppression. And there is a theory that later orders such as the Masonic order may owe their origin to those surviving Knights Templar. That's a whole other conversation, but there is an interesting book called Born in Blood, which advocates this theory and makes a strong argument on the basis of linguistics that terms used in traditional Masonry appear to come from Old French, which makes very little sense in the context of the conventional story of the origin of Masonry. But it does make sense if Masonry is older than it's given credit for, particularly if it might have an origin with the Knights Templar, who were, at the time of their destruction, heavily connected with France. Hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. And hello to Julia. If I didn't already say hello, it's good to see you. And so these are some of the problems with even discussing this as a historic phenomenon. Whether the Knights Templar did anything at all is a big question, and most academics, I think, would say they did not, that the accusations were wholly fabricated. And they would point out that the descriptions of Baphomet vary widely. But in the esoteric world, many people believe that the accusations had truth in them, but are exaggerated. And they would say, I believe in many cases, that the description of the image of Baphomet varies widely because there was more than one of them and they were not identical, or alternatively because it had many aspects, very much in line with those late Hellenistic and imperial era deities that you see in the practice of magic, who usually involve many different attributes in their images. And this confirms to those images discussed in the 18th century. It conforms to those images. But again, their actual origin is highly debatable. So was there actually a Baphomet in history to even talk about? And I would have to say, there's no proof of it. Now, does that make it an illegitimate deity? No, that's not how deities work. Does that make it illegitimate for modern metaphysical practice? No. But it does mean that there are even more than usual differences in how people interpret it. And a lot of people, and a number of academics will try to say the name Baphomet is a corruption of the name Muhammad because of the Knights Templar's association with the Near East. But this is not a credible suggestion because everyone in Crusades era Europe knew the name Muhammad. There was no mistaking it. They'd been fighting wars with the Near East for several hundred years. They were quite familiar with those things. Possibly it could have been manufactured to sound like it, but I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense either. Could be a nonsense word, but there is a suggestion that it comes from the Greek Baphometus. And I personally agree with that. It makes sense to me. And that means bathed in wisdom or baptized in wisdom, which for an esoteric deity is a perfectly appropriate name. So if I think of the idea of a deity, Baphomet, that's the name I'm thinking, the origin I'm thinking. And I'm thinking of an androgynous deity who represents balance and the union of all things. For want of a better way to put it, a depiction of primordial deity before the universe was divided in all its component parts. And if you look at that traditional description of Baphomet, which is replicated in Alifa LeVay's image, it basically is stressing a union of opposites. It has put together a lot of different component parts, and most of those parts do come from the trials of the Knights Templar. But I would argue that those 18th century images strike me as being much more useful, but they too involve many different disparate aspects that do not lend to just one image. Some of them are shown with a mural crown, which is a very important aspect of many antique deities. They commonly have horns. They often have, often they're depicted with chains. And chains in certain aspects of late Hellenistic and Gnostic thought represent the physical world. And if you have studied Correllianism, you will also know that we sometimes reference that image from Charles Dickens of the soul being chained to its actions in life. We see this in Dickens as the ghosts in the Christmas Carol who are dragging the chains of their misdeeds. And we really liken karma to this idea that it's a chain, but you hold it yourself. And in many of those pictures, that's what Baphomet is shown doing. But again, we're talking about the 18th century ones. But these are where the images of Baphomet come from. And let me just take a moment and see if I can reference a few more of those. Not easily, but you can look it up yourself under Josef von Hammer-Purgstall. And these images appeared on cups and bowls and boxes. And are they genuine? Who knows? But for the history of this figure, who is certainly a contemporary figure, they should be more important than they are. Eliphas Levi is the one who made this a modern figure. I think that what he was trying to say about it was misunderstood, but there's always a segment of the conservative Christian world who's going to misinterpret anything that comes out of metaphysics. They will oogie boogie it, for want of a better way to put it. Neither Eliphas Levi nor his image of Baphomet, I don't believe, were intended to represent anything negative. And in fact, the words solve and coagula appear in connection to the Baphomet image, which says that it's an alchemical image and that it represents alchemical thought. Alchemy is a system of understanding the world, usually using the symbolism of the physical interaction between substances, but not exclusively. If you study alchemy from a philosophical point of view, you'll see a lot of things that are present in modern Wicca and other modern metaphysical ideas that don't necessarily realize they're alchemical, such as the marriage between the solar king and the lunar queen, and what this means. The idea of the alchemical marriage represents spiritual enlightenment at one level, incarnation at another. And it's very much part and parcel of modern metaphysical thought. And for Levi, the figure of Baphomet is also encapsulating that alchemical thought, which ultimately comes down to the union of all things. So this very hybrid figure with its goat head and wings and other things, for him, and I think for many people who do follow what they identify as Baphomet, under one of these various interpretations, would say the same thing, I think, for the most part. It's an androgynous deity. It has both male and female aspects, and that makes it part of a very old tradition, even if we were to regard it as going back no farther than the 1850s. But androgynous deities were very much part of the ancient world, part of modern religions like Hinduism. It's a very widespread thought, and it represents the unity of existence. It represents the idea that everything comes from an ultimate source, which is expressed in them. Hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. Good to see you, Ravenwolf. So these are some of the things I would say about Baphomet. If you study the Knights Templar, are you going to find that the trial transcripts uphold these modern ideas about Baphomet? I don't know that I'd say you will. I'd also not necessarily say it matters, but I don't know that I'd say you will. But on the other hand, the trial transcripts represent what the prosecutors wanted them to show. And Laurie remarks on what a nameful, and that must be on Josef von Hammer-Prunstab. And well, you know, German, 18th century. Yes, indeed. It's a bit of a mouthful. But the figure of the androgyne isn't seen as often as you would think it would be seen in modern paganism, but it's a very important point in traditional paganism. Figures such as I mentioned, Cybele, Eurynome, the Diana of the Vangelo delle Streghe, even Heracles in the ancient world have this aspect. You find it in Hinduism, you find it all over the place. And I think that in our modern diverse pagan community, we really should make more of it than we do. Of course, from a conservative Christian point of view, a deity with multiple or indistinct genders is absolutely horrifying. And you see them react to that throughout history. And to the extent that Baphomet may have existed for the Knights Templar, this was perhaps part of what produced such a pronounced reaction. But it's generally agreed the Knights Templar were destroyed because the King of France happened to owe them a great deal of money and wanted to get out of paying for it. While we're on that subject, another famous figure from history, the Countess Elizabeth Baphomet, who is sometimes referred to as Countess Dracula, and the biggest female serial killer in history, was also in a similar position as being the largest debtor of the Holy Roman, or the largest debt holder of the Holy Roman Emperor at the time that she was prosecuted. And a lot of people today hold the view that the story is simply not true, that it was really the emperor trying to get out of having to pay his debt, and the fact that the Countess was also the only Protestant noblewoman in a predominantly Catholic empire at this point. And so she had very little defense. But that's a whole other story, but also a fascinating one. And it raises a number of questions about who writes the history. And of course, the victor always does. Is the story of Elizabeth Bathory actually written honestly? Is it possible to tell now, after hundreds of years? Is the story of the Knights Templar written honestly? Is it possible to tell after almost, well, hundreds and hundreds of years, not quite 1,000 years? The general thought in the case of the Knights Templar is no. The same consensus has not been reached regarding the Countess Bathory, but the truth of the matter is nobody knows, and I don't know that anyone can. And this is one of the interesting things about history. When we look at any piece of history that's beyond living memory, the question, who wrote this? How many versions are there by how many people? These are important to whether it's trustworthy. And if it's not trustworthy, whether it's still useful. We all have heard, surely because our culture is fascinated with them, about the mad emperor Caligula or the mad emperor Nero. But these two emperors, and also several others, share something in common, and that is that these things were said about them after they died, and in some cases considerably, when the new regime had an interest in promoting this attitude. But often, even the writers say that people didn't feel that way at the time, which leads to the question, are these sensationalized accounts? We have no way to know. in most cases. Even in more modern cases, it can be hard to determine what really happened. I remember a few years ago, there was a considerable controversy about the incident at Meyerling, where Crown Prince Rudolph took his own life and murdered his mistress, Maria Vecchera, or I should say Mary Vecchera, because she went by Mary, not Maria. Fascinating case, but there was a huge theory that they were actually both murdered by the British, who did not want to see the prince's more liberal attitudes overtaking his conservative father's attitudes. And this was being bandied about as if it was quite a respectable theory, and for a while it was. It has now been completely debunked because letters from Mary Vecchera have come to light that make very clear that not only was this as it was perceived, but she knew what she was walking into. You won't hear that theory so much now, but for a little while it was a big one. Another one is Anna Leonowens and the king of what was then Siam. A few years ago, the common wisdom was that she was a complete liar and had totally made up the story of her adventures in the kingdom of Siam. And then letters turned up in the royal archives of Siam that said that if anything, she had tended to be rather modest in her description, that she actually had been an advisor to the king who did take her advice seriously. It's also worth bearing in mind, she did not write the books that most people reference, and they don't necessarily completely reflect her version of that story. Another famous example of a story that's gone back and forth is Rasputin. Even today, if you reference most accounts of the life of Rasputin, you'll get a very sensational story. But since the archives of the Russian secret police became public in the 1990s, one of the things that's been learned is he wasn't nearly as controversial in reality as they made him out to be. What they found in following him and so forth, they had to embroider considerably, and did, to make him such a controversial figure. The reality, though still capable of having considerable controversy, was absolutely colored by the victor who wrote the history, and the fact that for a long time no other details were available. Same is true of Prince Felix Yusupov and his story of how that murder occurred, which at the very least has now been shown to have been heavily embroidered. And the theory that showed up for a while that the British had done that too, and merely used Prince Felix and Archduke Dmitri. I believe Dmitri was an archduke, when in fact they didn't act independently as they claimed. So you have to be careful with how much you put into some of these accounts based on what happened after and who wrote it. Doesn't mean they aren't useful, doesn't mean they might not be right. Does mean you always have to remember they could be wrong. And with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to once again recommend my Patreon to you at revdonlewis.com. I want to thank you for being here. I love spending this time with you. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Let us close with our prayer. And I love you all. I love this time. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we ask you to help us to be sensible in our attitudes and our actions. Help us to always examine our sources and make our decisions based on track record and what seems seriously likely. Help us to be wise in our walk in life. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and respect in knowing you're always with you. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you blessed be now and always. I thank you for your presence, and may you blessed be now and always. And I will see you tomorrow.